All right, so I've known you for a while, Nick, but for those who don't, who are you?
Hi, well, thank you, Franny, for inviting me to do this interview. I'm very honored. My name is Nicholas Dungey. I'm a professor of political philosophy, and I've been teaching in universities for the last 25 years. And my research is in modern and postmodern political philosophy, and I also teach classes on international relations and international political economy.
All right, so today we're going to talk a little about activism, which is something you're very passionate about.
Yep.
And so how would you define what activism is?
Sure. Well, at its most fundamental level, at its deepest level, and at its most simple level, activism is animated by love. All activism begins in love. And it begins in two types of love. It begins in self-love, which I define as the ongoing, unending pursuit and acquisition of knowledge that helps us become better people. And you hear this all the time. I'm actively engaged in learning, or I'm actively engaged in improving myself. I'm actively engaged in becoming a better person.
Yeah.
And that's activism at its most profound existential level. That's the origin of activism, right? Self-love and the ongoing, unending acquisition of knowledge that helps us be the best people we can be. And activism is also animated by another type of love. And that is the love human beings have for the community. And not just the community, but the love for the world we share, the environment. And the second kind of love, which, by the way, Plato called justice, the second kind of love, which is love for the community, means that each of us have an inescapable moral responsibility to take our genius and our talent and our creativity and our resources and give it to others to elevate their lives, and give it to the community to elevate the community, to make better communities. And as I said, that is the origin of justice, right? So activism is driven by love. You are actively engaged in becoming a better person all the time, and you're taking your responsibility, your talents and your genius, and you are giving it to the community to make the community better.
That's so beautifully said. All right, so when do you think people first started to engage in activism?
Sure.
And what are some of the earliest examples?
Well, Western history is synonymous with activism. Literally, activism began in ancient Greece around 500 BC with the first activists, common people who wanted some involvement and some voice in governance, right? And this was the first democracy in Western civilization. The first democracy in Western civilization was brought about by that first activist, right, who said, we would like to have a voice, we would like to participate in the governance of our shared lives. Activism. And it wasn't just this activism in terms of the emergence of democracy. One of the first great activists in Western civilization was Socrates. Socrates was the first philosopher. And Socrates spent 30 years walking around ancient Athens, talking to anybody who would listen about, one, how do we live better? How do we become better human beings? And how do we make the community better? How do we live together better? And again, that was justice. So Socrates was one of the first great activists. And activism has been a driving force of Western civilization at every critical moment in our collective history. So there were activists. John Locke was one of the great activists, and in 1688 he gave common people the right to revolt. John Locke said, if you are in a time and place where your government is no longer serving you or is hostile, you have this activist right to revolt. And that gave rise to the American Revolution. It gave rise to the French Revolution. it set in motion all the great activist moments in the 20th century. Gandhi's non-violent, pacifist social disobedience and the activism that it mobilized, ended the British Empire in India. In America, in the 1950s, the Little Rock Nine high school kids participating in activism, refusing to continue to be educated in segregated school systems, demanded for the integration of the school system. Martin Luther King, the great civil rights activist who led the civil rights movement in the 60s. Yeah. So activism is driven by love, and it is the driving force of Western civilization and all the critical and powerful and transformative moments in Western civilization.
Yeah. So some of these examples happened a long, long time ago. So do you think activism was different historically, and how has it evolved over time to what it is now?
Yeah. Well, the answer is both no and yes. So activism, whether it's the activism of a Socrates or the activism of a Martin Luther King, the love and the desire to become a better person and to create a better world, that is exactly the same. The love that Socrates had for his fellow Athenians and to elevate the city, right, to make it more just, is the same love that Martin Luther King had in the I Have a Dream speech. It is exactly the same love. Love animates activism. Now, are they different? Of course. Certainly, the ancient Athens, the small city-state of ancient Athens, looks very different to the large post-industrial, digital, global nation-state like America. And so the activism is quite different. You and I now have access, immediate, instantaneous access to information.
It's a different
from
world.
all around the world, and especially information about the injustices that are occurring, the unjust exploitation of resources, the unjust political oppression of minorities. Wherever it's happening in the world, we now know about it. So activism is global.
Yeah. So do you think activism has had an impact upon ancient and modern day society, and how do you think it will continue to?
Yes, absolutely. Well, certainly, as we said, Western civilization begins with Socrates. Socrates was the first great activist. He was the first great political activist. And he set in motion what we now understand as Western civilization. He's the one that discovered philosophy and set in motion Western civilization. And certainly the way in which activism emerges in modernity, beginning in the 1600s and really picking up pace in the 20th century, all through the 1900s, the great activisms of decolonization and the activisms for the sort of the enfranchisement of women to vote in the 1919, right? The enfranchisement of the broader and deeper democratic community into the political process. So there's absolutely no question that activism is the defining characteristic of human social, economic, and political history.
Yeah. So now getting into a little more personal questions. So why are you personally so interested in activism?
Well, I teach political philosophy. Right? And political philosophy, there's a very direct connection between political philosophy and activism, because political philosophy, as I said, was discovered by Socrates. And Socrates was the first. Socrates is important, and he's the father of philosophy, and he's the first to say there's an objective truth out there about our own virtue, about what it means to be a good person, and there's a truth out there about justice. And the core mission of philosophy, and by the way, philosophy means the love of wisdom, right? That's what philosophy means, the love of wisdom. And as we were relating it to activism earlier, a kind of love of what kinds of wisdom? Well, a self-love and a love for the community.
Yeah.
And political philosophy is the ongoing, unending search for wisdom about how to be the best damn person one can be. And then the awareness that I and you and we have a responsibility to share that wisdom and that talent and that genius with others to elevate their lives and with the community to build more just communities.
Yes, it was also beautifully said. So how do you think present day activism will shape our future?
Yeah, well, it already is.
Yeah.
So first of all, the most magical thing is that activism is now a thing.
Yeah.
Right? Activism is mainstream. Activism has become mainstream in the last 10 years. And it's become global.
Yeah.
Right? And activism as something that is mainstream and that is something that has gone global is really the final fulfillment of the activist vision, and that is young people around the world have become self-aware. They've become woke in many ways, and they no longer tolerate injustice. They no longer tolerate injustice to minority communities or to people with different sexualities or to people with different races or economic inequality. They no longer tolerate it. And that's what's really profound about the new activism. There is a shift in human consciousness now occurring all around the world, especially among your generation, about how we're going to define who we are. What does it mean to be a human being? How do we be the best damn people we can be? And how do we care for and elevate the lives of others? And how do we create social and political communities that are more inclusive? And how do we leave the environment better than we found it? That's what the new activism is.
Yeah, I completely agree. So what do you think are some of the most important issues that activism could have a major impact upon?
Well, the most important thing that has happened in the last 50 years that has fundamentally changed the sort of scope of activism that is now global is the fact that the global community, that communities have become global.
Yeah.
We live in a fully integrated global economy.
Yeah.
We travel easily and extensively. We now appreciate the interdependency of various environmental systems around the world. So we are a global community, and activism is now awareness of the interdependent and integrated elements of what it means to be a global citizen.
Yeah. So moving on, why would you say people like me and like our youth should care about activism instead of sitting and playing video games all day or doing things like that?
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to say about that is it's always important to remember, to first know and then remember the differences between purposes and pleasures.
Yes.
Right? That's a very, very important thing to know in life in general. The difference between purposes and pleasures. Now, we have our purposes.
Yeah.
Our individual purposes in our lives are to, again, try to become and live the best people we can, and to treat the people who are in our lives with as much kindness and respect and love as humanly possible. That's our purpose as human beings. And we have our political purpose, right? We are citizens. No matter where you are in the world, you are a citizen somewhere, right? And so we have political purposes. We have an inescapable moral responsibility, as I've said, to take our talent and our education and our genius and our creativity and share it with other human beings and share it with the political community to elevate the lives of people who, for a variety of reasons, may be suffering, and to commit ourselves to the ongoing pursuit of justice. So we have our purposes. Those are our purposes. Now, we also have our pleasures. We have our video games, and we have our hobbies and our video games and all the things that give us pleasure. And the pleasures are very important, of course. Of course, the pleasures are very important. But one must always be alert to the danger that our pleasures become our purpose.
Yes.
Right? So my message to not just young people, but to everybody, right? Always remember the difference between purpose and pleasure, and don't let your pleasure become your purpose.
I like that. I
Your
like that
pleasure is
saying.
your pleasure,
Yeah.
but don't ever let your pleasure become your purpose.
Yeah. All right. So what are some of your personal stances in the activism world today, and what are you currently engaged in?
So I'm particularly obsessed with economic inequality and racial injustice.
Yeah.
I find the global economic situation just unacceptable.
Yeah.
The vast and systemic inequality in wealth between not just the wealthy nations and less wealthy nations, but among a handful of global families who own and control the vast majority of global wealth. And not just wealth in terms of money, but access, control over resources, control over land, control over water, control over access to knowledge. Right? That for me is the most important issue. And the second one for me is the importance of authentic recognition of the dignity and the beauty of the way other people live their lives. Right? So racial justice, the recognition of the LGBTQ community and the transgender community. Right? You can't have democracy. You can't have justice if you don't have authentic inclusion of all the people in the community as participants in the community.
All right. So thank you for sitting down with me.
It's been really a pleasure, Franny. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And it's the end.